homeopathy, one of the ways we come up with remedies is we wonder what people's delusions are, and we kind of ask about that, and someone might say, some of them are really obvious, like dreams, are delusions. But, there are things that happen all the time, like in my PTSD clients, especially the ones who have military PTSD.
Awake, this is Mental Mythos, hosted by Asekho Toto. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Mental Mythos. I'm your host, Asekho Toto, and before we dive into today's incredible conversation, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover the valuable insights we share every week. And if you find today's episode particularly inspiring or insightful, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think could benefit from it. Thank you for your support. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's get back into our conversation.
Can you share us the story of how you first stumbled upon homeopathy?
The first time I found out about homeopathy was many, many years ago, couple of decades ago, over 30 actually. And I was out walking my dog. It was a typical Minnesota winter day. And there was a dog on a front door at a house we walked by and was barking at my dog. And he was a puppy, got all excited, pulled me down on the ice, and I ended up with a big bruise on my knee. Well, later that day, I was due to go over to a friend's house, and I asked her for some ice. And she said, "Well, you should take some arnica for that." And I said, "Some what?" And so she told me that arnica was a homeopathic remedy that was used for trauma, physical trauma. And so I later that day or the next day, something like that, I went to a local store that had a very large selection of retail remedies. And so I picked up some arnica as she suggested, but I also picked up a book or two or three about homeopathy, figuring I ought to know what I was doing. And by the time I got done reading those books, I decided I was going to be a homeopath.
So just like that, would you say that that arnica is arnica?
Arnica, Montana. It is a mountain daisy, and it was turned into a homeopathic remedy. Mm-hmm.
Oh, so would you say that in a way it led you on a road of being quite interested in homeopathy?
Yes, definitely.
And it's not something that happens a lot for someone in terms of first time hearing about this and being intrigued of pursuing it. And how was your research in terms of that you realized that it's something that you needed? This is something that you are meant to do.
It was so long ago, it's hard to remember other than the feeling that I knew it was the right thing to do.
Actually, the only thing that you had it really, in a way, you followed your gut, something that most of us don't do in terms of your instinct. You follow your instinct. So, in terms of how has homeopathy shaped the way you understand mental health compared from then and now?
Oh, okay. Well, obviously, the more I learned about homeopathy in the process of going to homeopathy school, the more I learned about all of this. And, I think back in the day when I was, in my early 30s, I was very much, just whatever the doctor said. I was a healthy person generally, so it didn't really affect me much. But what I have found is that, people have a certain energetic quality that we put out, and it has us behave and see and think and believe certain things. Every one of us is delusional. Um, we just don't know it. So, um, in homeopathy, one of the ways we come up with remedies is we wonder what people's delusions are, and we kind of ask about that, and someone might say, some of them are really obvious, like dreams, are delusions. But, there are things that happen all the time, like in my PTSD clients, especially the ones who have military PTSD, the one of the things that they do is they look for an escape route whenever they're in a room with a lot of people. This is a very common symptom for people with PTSD from military. Because first of all, that's what they're trained to do in the military. And then second of all, they have PTSD. So they're kind of looking for these exits because something has happened to them in the past. So that's a delusion that something's going to happen again, or this time. It's just that they think anytime they go in public, some of them do, that something's going to happen. So that's a mental health symptom, just by example. So, another example would be if I drive over this bridge, it's going to collapse. That's a delusion. It almost never happens. Almost never. The percentage of people who have driven over a bridge that has collapsed is minuscule. But yet, some people believe it, and we have remedies that cover that symptom.
It goes back to that thing of I'm afraid of water. Like when I'm in a boat, I have this intense fear of this boat will drown and no one will save me in terms of that. That's why I try by any means to avoid boats. And also in terms of flights, what if the plane crashes? And my biggest fear is escalators. Because when you step on escalators, when you're about to go off, I'm afraid that my foot will get in there and probably I will be injured. So one of the things that were those are my fears, and sometimes it's hard to just let go of them. In a perspective of homeopathy, how does it work? How do you help someone like that has fear, and as you said that in the military, thinking that always want to run from something?
Well, in order to answer that question, I need to explain a little bit more about remedies and how we know what they heal. So remedies, homeopathic remedies do go through a study, and it's a process called a proving. And a proving is where maybe a couple dozen people go through, take a new remedy, and they don't know what it is. They don't know what it's made from. And they take it, and in the healthy people, it produces a certain set of symptoms. And so, if you suddenly start having a new symptom, like, I really can't walk downstairs without feeling like I'm going to fall forward and die. And you've never felt that way before. Well, that would be a new symptom. And that would be a symptom that could be attributed to having taken that remedy. And then we have a couple dozen people, involved in approving. And so in all likelihood, more than one person is going to have that symptom. Several people will, from having taken that remedy. And then we know that if somebody comes into our office and they have this feeling that they're going to fall down the stairs, and by the way, they also have some other symptoms of a remedy that has that. For example, there's a remedy called lac caninum, which has that symptom that they're going to fall down the stairs. There's a remedy called boron that has that symptom. But, boron also has a fear of going up and down. So if somebody came in and they had an up and down fear, well, they're probably going to have, know that that's the remedy they're going to need. And so what we try to do is we look at mental, emotional, and physical symptoms and try to narrow it down. It's very hard to just narrow down a remedy on just physical symptoms, because there are limited numbers of physical symptoms, and a lot of them are really common. Like I have a runny nose and it's clear. Well, so do 600 remedies. So we have to know more about the entire person. So it's very holistic. So it would involve an intake. And if it's an acute thing, like a cold or the flu or something like that, an injury, it doesn't take long. But if it's a chronic thing, it's an hour and 45-minute intake to narrow down the symptoms and get the symptoms that are needed to come up with a remedy.
And how does it differ? It differ from conventional medicine in treating mental health issues.
Okay. Well, traditional medicine operates on a diagnosis equals prescription model. So you have this diagnosis, we have these 4 drugs that you can try. And maybe a 5th or 6th one because we found that it helped it, even though that wasn't the original intent, right? With homeopathy and frankly with herbalism also, we look to nature to see what might be interesting to create a remedy out of and do a proving. Homeopathy means similar suffering. Homeo means similar and pathy meaning suffering. And it was a phrase coined by Dr. Samuel Hahnemann in the late 1700s, early 1800s. He's a German physician who developed the principles of homeopathy. So what we do in terms of helping heal a mental health condition is we look at the whole picture. And so if somebody else came in that same day with the same diagnosis, in all likelihood, they would not need the same remedy. They would need probably a different one because there are, thousands of remedies. Anything on earth is, or even probably a moon rock as well, has potential healing properties. So we have to know our client. And then homeopathy works on an energetic basis. It's not working on a material chemical basis. A lot of people say, well, there's nothing in it. Well, there's energy in it, and that's what we want. Whereas Western medicine, it works on a chemical basis. There's chemicals in those capsules or tablets that you take, or the liquid or whatever it is. But in homeopathy, it works entirely energetically. I shouldn't say entirely. There are circumstances where we use remedies that are a combination of both. But for the most part, for mental health, it is on an energetic basis.
Is it? I was about to ask that in terms of, is it something that it only heals? For instance, you mentioned arnica, whereas you had physical trauma. I would about to ask you, is it something that one can benefit from if they have some mental issue in terms of emotional issue or physical issue? I was about to ask that. I guess.
Do you mean does arnica have that?
No.
Are you asking about arnica in particular?
No, not arnica in particular, but also the homeopathy in general, in terms of how it is in terms of when it comes to healing, because definitely, as you mentioned, that diagnoses differ in terms of they won't only give you one medicine, but several pills of actually they are not sure what you have and what will work for you. So I'm asking these things.
Okay. Generally, homeopathy, classical homeopathy, the way that Dr. Hahnemann taught it, and is a one remedy at a time quest. But there are circumstances where I will add a second remedy, and it would be a situation like this. Somebody has PTSD. They've been taking a lot of medication. It has affected their liver. And let's say now they have eczema. Because if your liver can't function to detox, guess where it's going to go? It's going to go on your skin. And so you can end up with some eczema on your skin. So what I would do in a situation like that is, if the remedy that really stands out from the intake of the client also covers the liver, I might not give a second remedy. But if it doesn't, I'll give a second really, really low, very physical remedy that affects only the liver. And I'll do that, along with a higher potency remedy that affects the entire body, mental, emotional, and physical. And, a lot of people come in only for physical symptoms. And it turns out that they didn't know they could be helped for mental and emotional symptoms at the same time.
Definitely. The way you firstly explained it, how it is, and how you came across it is the fact that I thought it was only made for only physical trauma, not also emotional one. So that's why I wanted to, in a way, ask that question, because, and also while I was watching that short video, and you mentioned another about grief. What is the process of homeopathy in terms of dealing with grief?
Okay, well, the process would be the same for any mental health issue. We do an intake and we investigate the chief complaint, but then we ask other questions like, what was it like when you were growing up? And, what kind of dreams do you have at night? What are your fears? Some people have no fear, but, and, just wanting to get a really well-rounded picture of someone. And, from there, then, we'll ask a little bit more about the grief. And, there are some really common homeopathic grief remedies. One of them is Ignatia. Anyone who's listening to this who knows about homeopathy a little bit, that's one of the first remedies they think about. And Ignatia is interesting because it's more appropriate if it was a shocking situation where you just weren't expecting it. Like the person just passed away unexpected, or it could have been like a car accident that they died in or something. No one ever expects that, right? So, so it isn't just grief, but it's grief accompanied by shock. And then there's another very common grief remedy called Natrum Muriaticum. And that one's a mineral. And that can be from a current grief, but it's more likely an old grief that you've held on to for a long time. And you might be even irritable about something, or just something you refuse to talk about. A lot of times people take that remedy when they refuse to talk about their grief or their trauma, and all of a sudden they're willing to talk about it. And then, there's other grief remedies as well. For example, there's a remedy made from a swan feather. And so no swans died in the making of that remedy. And it's a very, very deep grief. So if anyone has ever seen the movie The Notebook, for example.
I've heard of it.
And have you seen it?
I don't think so. I haven't watched it. I always seen those clips on Instagram.
Okay, well, you should watch it, and then you'll understand this remedy. So it's Ryan Gosling is in the movie with Rachel McAdams, and they were this couple that they met when they were younger, and they her parents broke them up, and they went on to live their lives for a while. And he was just in so much very, very deep grief. He was in the military, and then he came home, and she was getting married to somebody else, and just this incredibly deep grief, like the love of my life has died. Well, that's the swan remedy. So it's a different layer of grief. So that's why it's so important to really, suss out the information. And if they won't give it to you, then it's probably Natrum Muriaticum because they hold on to things and they don't want to share. So.
Still on the conversation of grief, let's say, for instance, before I ask this question, in terms of what type of people that you have seen in terms of dealing grief, what I mean by that is the fact that have you dealt with someone who have lost a person for, let's say, three people in 3 years, within 3 years, and they came to you, tried to seek help? Have you come across a person like that?
Absolutely. Yes. People have come and they might, what usually brings them on in isn't the grief, even though they have it. It's usually been around so long that they have developed physical symptoms around that grief. And so then they come in to see me to get help with the physical things, and they find themselves having to talk about their mental and emotional symptoms too. That's usually how it ends up. There might be somebody who says, my husband died 3 years ago and I just can't recover from that. I just can't move on. That has certainly happened. But the more likely scenario with grief is they don't even know they have it, or they have it, but they're really coming for his physical symptom.
And probably in every practice, in every mental well-being practice, actually, there are some, or let me say, in every mental health practice or mental health disorders, there are misconceptions. So, what are some common misconceptions about homeopathy that you encountered?
Well, one of the most common ones is that there's no research that shows it's effective, which is not true. But, the thing is that the studies have to be done differently because of this diagnosis equals prescription thing, right? So Western medicine can say, okay, we developed this great new drug, and anyone who has this diagnosis, sign up and see if you're eligible to be in our study. So that's a lot. And we want to see if this one drug works. Now, when I did what I would call a preliminary study, I invited about 15 people who had a PTSD diagnosis to join my study. And they had that diagnosis, but my goal was to see how homeopathy in general affected PTSD, not if a particular remedy helped it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I wanted to see if I could, how the diagnosis and how the symptoms would shift by giving an appropriate homeopathic remedy. So that is one of the misconceptions, is that there's no research on homeopathy. There absolutely is. The problem is that it's usually published in journals that Western medicine doctors don't read. Why would they find it if they're in journals? Right?
Yeah. And also, when it comes to study, as someone who is doing homeopathy, usually is it specific in terms of is it a requirement every homeopathic, someone that practices homeopathic should do a study before they practice A homeopathic.
No, they don't need to do that. Most homeopaths are generalists, and I still see a lot of people who don't have PTSD. But I very specifically wanted to just focus on it for a number of reasons. One is to sort of suss out what the categories of people were who had PTSD, because I thought that would be useful. And then the other thing was to be able to maybe limit the number of remedies that needed to be considered. Because the more times you see a person with a particular diagnosis, the quicker it becomes the next time you see them to narrow down the remedy. And so it's about efficiency and effectiveness. We just want to be able to get people healed as quickly as possible. And so that's the reason for specializing in something like I did.
Quite interesting, actually. And how can I put this? How important does the patient need to know? Actually, there's a saying in my language which says that in order for something to work for you, you need to believe in it.
Okay.
For example,
all right.
If I come to
yes. And so you're wondering, do people need to believe in homeopathy in order for it?
Instead of believing but having information, would you say that does having necessary information about homeopathy, is it what role does importance of education of gauging oneself plays in when it comes to homeopathy treatment?
Okay. Well, let me just address this in a couple of ways. First of all, homeopathy is not a religion, so you don't have to believe in it for it to work. Okay?
Yes.
But believing you will get better regardless of the modality. It could be acupuncture, it could be chiropractic, it could be homeopathy, it could be Western medicine. You always have a better outcome if you believe you can get better. It doesn't matter what the modality is. That's just always true. So there's that. And then I try not to tell my clients too much about their remedy the first time, because I don't want them to expect that they will feel a certain way. What I want them to do is to pay attention to their symptoms and see if they get better or if they get worse. And, so when people leave, a lot of times they'll say, well, okay, so pay attention and see how much do you seem to fall asleep faster? And how often are you having those bad dreams? And, we can pick out certain things to focus on to see if it gets better. And, there are certain things, by the way, that take longer to heal than other things. So for example, if you have, let's say your hair is falling out, just for example.
Yeah.
Well, if that's not particularly hard on your vital force, but your respiratory problems are, the remedy's probably going to focus more on the respiratory problems first, but we can never predict that. There's Hering's law of cure, which is inside out, top down. And so if somebody has a symptom and it moves down their body, we see that as a healing pattern, even if they're not better immediately. Makes sense?
It actually does. And I agree with you. When it comes to believing that this thing will work, you will get better results. I definitely believe in that. And
regardless of the modality.
Definitely. And what are your thoughts on the integration of homeopathy with conventional mental health care?
Well, I think that if somebody needs therapy, they should get it. But my experience has been, and there was a woman in my study who just expressed this so clearly. She said, I tried so many different mental health things, different meditation programs, all of this, she said, and none of them worked until I did homeopathy.
Mm.
And then once she had been on this remedy for 4 or 5 months, she would try to do some of these other things and they actually worked better. So it can kind of, help clear out some of the garbage in the way, of what's in the way of seeing yourself clearly. You need to see the goal of therapy in some ways is to see yourself more clearly and then to find ways to do things differently to make your life happier and work better for you. Right. But, if you've got something that's really, a problem for you, kind of a mental block, I guess you could call it, no matter how hard you try, you won't necessarily get better until that goes away. We all think we have free will, but we don't.
Mm.
But only homeopathy gets us in a place where we have a little bit more.
And I would like to dive deeply a little bit on terms of therapy. And what I've seen of interviewing people for the last 4 years. And one thing that I've realized, that people are running away from the Western side when it comes to mental well-being, mental health. I've heard about Reiki, I've learned about meditation, and today I've learned about new thing, homeopathy. Why do you think that people have ran away from therapy, from counseling, and have rather chosen the eastern side of medicine instead of the western side?
Well, not being one of those people, it's hard to, say for sure, but I can, offer a couple of ideas that I've thought about.
Mm.
I think sometimes it's a bad match between the therapist and the patient, and that can certainly make a difference. Sometimes it's money. And they can't afford to keep going to the therapist, although, that's gotten better because insurance is required to cover mental health. In the US at least. And, I just think that sometimes, as I said, you've got this thing and you're really stuck in it and you can't get past believing that, your parents were horrible people or whatever. I don't know. And, you need something that helps you get past that in order to really make the changes you need to make. And homeopathy is one of those things. I just think that, suppressing the symptoms with drugs doesn't help unstick you.
Definitely doesn't help at all.
No.
And I really find it I find it really hard to wrap my mind around that. Having, for example, dealing with this mental health issue, dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety, dealing with grief, and you go and find the coping mechanism as drinking or doing drugs, and as much as I'm not judging anyone, but sometimes we have to disagree on something, because I don't see the need of I would say the essence of finding help, of escaping reality on those things. You could try some things, not those things that will bring you down, that will make your mental well-being very poor, and and you end up not realizing who you are later on. And I'm seeing that we are almost out of time. And before I let you go, I have a final question
Uh-huh.
for you. how can listeners support and get involved with your work you are doing with homeopathy?
Well, if somebody thinks they have PTSD and they would like to figure out how bad it is, or if they just want some mental health help, I have a quiz they can take. And I put this quiz together. It was based on a couple of different sources. One was just a yes-no questionnaire that was developed by the Anxiety and Depression Association in kind of based on the DSM-5, and 17 questions. And then I thought, well, yes and no isn't really enough. And so I added in a scale on 1 to 7, where 1 is as bad as it can be and 7 is as good as it can be. Now, that part of it is not on this particular PTSD quiz that I have out online, but people could go to ptsdquiz.com, ptsdquiz.com, and they can fill that out, and it'll come to me. They'll get a report on whether they need help or not, and I'll reach out to them and see if they would like to work further. On that same page, where the PTSD quiz link is on my website, and it is also will take them to a place or take them to a bunch of testimonials are on that same page. And you can also just book an appointment from that page as well.
Yeah.